I've come across so many tweets like this one in the last few days, and there's so many that I look at, and so many that I say, "Oh, bookmark it and talk about it." But I think I can just do series upon series of videos about tweets like that. But I could just narrow it down to just one video because to just belabor the point is it's not going to be conducive to the message I want to share with you people. But this particular tweet in question is good. I want you to see exactly how inhumane the people who are sympathetic to the comic book industry are. This gentleman here says his suicide undermines his credibility. He's a fan of problematic creators. He's seen people have success after things like this are revealed. And then scroll down here, he says, Ed Piscor needed to redeem himself, not to any old snarling jerk off on the internet, but to the people who actually worked with him, people who are actually in his life and whose infractions, however minor they may have actually been, affected negatively. Now, I want you to keep this in mind for later in the video because I'm going to show you something. And I'm going to show you why an apology from Ed would not have worked. It actually would have incriminated him and made it worse for him. But there are many tweets like this one here where the only person responsible for Ed Piscor's suicide is Ed Piscor, no matter what he wrote in his letter. So they've dehumanized what had happened to him. While I agree that Ed made the choice to take his own life, they won't ignore the events that led to him taking his life and the effects of the techniques that were used against him. I want to show you guys something. This is from Rules for Radicals. This is Saul Alinsky's book, also known as the extreme left's book for activism. Barack Obama was admittedly a fan of this book, so that was a red flag. Well, one of his many red flags, but let's not get into that. But I want to bring attention to the fifth rule. There's, I think, 12 rules in Rules for Radicals, but the fifth one is the one that people don't realize came from Alinsky. It's the fifth rule, also known as ridicule, is man's most potent weapon. It is almost impossible to counterattack ridicule. Also, it infuriates the opposition who then react to your advantage. So if people like Obama studied this book, I can almost promise you that this book is a tool used in the comic book industry because it is an industry run by radical leftists. And this is a tactic that's used by a lot of people that, it's used by people against targets that they want canceled. You isolate them, you ridicule them, you make them a pariah so that they can't turn to anybody, and they become weakened and ultimately dehumanized to the point of no return. And that's what Alinsky meant when he says that it's impossible to counterattack it. Further down, Alinsky says, one of the criteria in picking your target is the target's vulnerability. Where do you have the power to start? Furthermore, any target can always say, why do you center on me when there are others to blame as well? When you freeze the target, you disregard these arguments and, for the moment, all others to blame. I'm pretty sure that Ed Piskor was well aware of the Rules for Radicals and the tactics that people use from this book. And I'm pretty sure he understood that when it was his turn to be targeted and isolated from everything, he understood that there was no return from this. And he knew what was going to happen. He knew that he was going to be disregarded. He was going to be disrespected, ridiculed, mocked. His accusers would not be held to any standard of accountability because he was the chosen target. Alinsky continues, then as you zero in and freeze your target and carry out your attack, all of the others come out of the woodwork very soon. They become visible by their support of the target. So this is when Molly Dwyer came out and said those horrible things about Ed after he was chosen, picked for ridicule, after he was targeted. That's when you see Molly Wright, and that's when you see these other girls that came out, and then all of a sudden, Alex the Campy and Ramon Villalobos, those people start coming out, and now they join out of the woodwork. They join on the attack on Ed, and we've seen some of the tweets that Ramon Villalobos himself put out over the years on Ed Piscor. There's a great video by Richard C. Meyer where he documented years of tweets by Ramon Villalobos against Ed Piscor. He always had it out for him. So, and this was an opportunity for Villalobos to really go hammer in on him, and he had support. He had Alex the Campy, Molly Dwyer, Molly Wright, and Alinsky points out the individual target is easier to have hostility directed at because it's easier to have a specific target rather than a corporate entity. That's why when you look back at Ed Piscor's words on his note, his final note, when he talked about how he was being judged simultaneously by thousands of people, and he said no human being could sustain that. No human being was meant to go through that type of judgment. And that's what ended up with Piskor. He became a polarizing figure, and Jim Rugg, unfortunately, was placed in a position where he had no choice but to publicly denounce his friend. And the Pittsburgh Art Gallery had to kick him out and shut down his exhibit. And the book deal that he was going to sign, that was taken off the book. He became polarized. He became toxic because of the Alinsky tactic of being isolated, ridiculed, and marked. Ed Piscor also knew that owning up to any actions he was guilty of or apologizing for anything wasn't going to do any good. It would just escalate the polarization. The thing you got to understand with these people in the comic industry, there is no redemption. There's no apology that you can make that will brush everything to the side. There is no act of redemption you could do that's going to make people forget. There's nothing that you can do to these SJWs. And I hardly use the term SJWs because it's such an overused term. It's been used for people who disagree with you now. So if someone disagrees with you, then they're automatically an SJW. You know, if they have a wrong opinion, they're an SJW. If they don't go after someone you don't like, they're an SJW. You know, all of a sudden, it's become synonymous with the Nazi word or other words that used to have meaning, that used to be significant, but they're no longer significant. So I look at SJW as being in that same vein. But I'm using it in this case because it does apply, because the people in the comic industry, these people are social justice warriors. They literally are activists, and they employ activist tools and methods to go after their enemies. And when it was Ed Piscor's turn, you saw it happen in real time. You saw it happen from the moment he was accused up until he had no out but to take his own life. He really had no one to clear his name to at that point. He lost everything, and there was no point of return for him. This had ramifications for the rest of his life. This is not something you just automatically return from. You don't just turn the door on this one. You don't look back and able to build or rebuild from this. Although he could have. Ed could have. I shouldn't say he couldn't. He could have. But it would require him to turn his back on the comic industry entirely and go live a quiet life somewhere. But then that poses a different issue with Ed Piscor, which is that the comic book industry was his life. That was his identity. So when that was taken from him, he had nothing else. There was nothing for him. His identity was gone. On top of him being ridiculed and having his name smeared, there was really only one out for him, unfortunately. But this reminds me, and I was thinking about this earlier, and I said, "Oh yeah, I remember. This is very familiar." If you guys remember the Vic Mignogna situation, there was a guy by the name of Shane Holmes. Shane Holmesburg, I think his name is. I want to say his name, Shane Holmberg. Okay, and he went on Nick Rekieta's stream a few years ago. This was at the height of the Kick Vic phenomena that was the rage in Twitter and YouTube. And Rekieta invited him on to talk about the steps that were needed to be taken to get Vic Mignogna back in the conventions. Nick had the position that this guy was full of crack. But what I wanted to show you is what this guy Shane had said, because what he said in a couple of seconds, which I'll play for you, what he said mirrors exactly what some of these leftists are saying about what Ed could have done, how Ed could have just taken accountability. He had to apologize to his accusers and so forth. And what Nick illustrates, or what he expresses here, is why you never apologize to SJWs, why you never apologize for something that you're not guilty of, because an apology is an admission of guilt. I want to play this for you so you can see what I'm talking about.
You're not listening.
No, I am listening. I'm listening desperately for an answer. What hasn't Vic changed from? Spell it out. Because I've asked you how you walk back the fact that there are 4 credible.
Let me do this. Let me tell you this.
Why don't you just answer the question? What has Vic not changed from yet? Just answer the question. Okay, go ahead.
All right. For Vic to convince me, or someone, one of his fans, to convince me to book Vic right now, here's what would actually have to happen. There would actually have to be a conversation between me and Vic, or my guest services team and Vic, any of the guest services team and Vic, about the things that we need to do when he comes back. It would be such as, hey, this is the impression that's happened in the past.
What's the impression?
You already know what it is.
No, I don't. I want you to say it.
There are people who aren't comfortable with Vic when he's around them.
Okay.
So that would have to be the first thing. We would actually have to have a rule basically saying, hey, we need to be very mindful and careful when we're around attendees. That's it. Mindful and careful around attendees. Let's just make sure we're on our best behavior on attendees. Make sure that everyone that we're touching understands and completely understands what's going on.
Vic already said that in his answers to IO9.
This is my time, not yours. I'm talking about the rules that we're going to lay out. He already said it. These are the rules that we would lay out for my conventions.
Let's just be clear. This entire show is my time, but you can go ahead and talk.
All right. So we would make it clear and the rules that he needs to be very careful around attendees.
So just very quickly. So and it doesn't begin and end with an apology. It's you apologize, you admit culpability, and then you got to go through a series of rules. And this is before he even is considered eligible to return to the conventions here.
And they would make sure that he understands. There would be very strict rules in place, not just for him, but every guest.
So this isn't about like getting a guy redeemed. This is about control. And you're probably asking, why am I showing this when this has nothing to do with Ed Piscor? So this is the same type of environment running the voice actors industry that is also running the comic book industry. It's the same SJW rules. It's the same radical leftist views. The same requirements that are in place. This is why, as this gentleman here was talking about Vic Mignogna and the steps that Vic Mignogna had to take. This wasn't about redeeming him. This was about control. Ed Piscor would have had to gone under complete control of his oppressors, like a Ramon Villalobos, for them to even consider him even sniffing their backyard again.
There would be very strict rules around making sure they're careful around attendees, making sure they're careful when they're not around attendees, when they're out at a bar in the middle of the night, when they go back to their room, no attendees allowed in the room, just a whole wide swath of rules that we would put down, basically saying, here's what's acceptable.
This is always the way. This is always the way. If you bend the knee and accept any kind of culpability, they have you under control. They have you in the palm of their hands. This was never about doing things right by women. This is about just taking a man and controlling him and sending a message to the rest of the industry, which is we have your livelihood in the palm of our hands. And of course, with the accusations that were levied against Piskor, nobody would touch that with a 10-foot pole because he was polarized. This option would not have been available to Ed. Hence, he had nothing left for him. There was nowhere to turn to. There was nothing that he could have done to salvage his life. This is the comics pledge that a lot of the pros, the industry put out there. I think this was in 2020 after the Ellis allegations. And you can see here that the goal was putting men accountable. The idea was making men accountable for the safety of women. So it was already a one-sided, bigoted little pledge that they forced comic pros to take. And by the wording of the pledge here, the first one, for example, to never abuse, harass, groom, or manipulate women and all people of marginalized genders and sexes. So Ed Piscor had already, in their eyes, violated the first tenet right here. He already was accused of being a groomer. He was accused of abuse, which provably didn't happen. But regardless, when Villalobos and DeCampi and all those people started using the term victim or victims in reference to the women that came out in droves and accused Ed of all those things, that there was never going back for him. There was never going to be a return to form for Ed, because they held to this pledge. They absolutely held to this pledge. And with these women coming out and sabotaging Ed's income and success of the book deal and the exhibit that was going to open at the Pittsburgh Museum with his artwork, I mean, you can't argue with the timing of that, can you? And this also, you guys remember after Warren Ellis had to face those accusations of quote unquote predatory behavior, and then what ended up happening was similar to what this guy suggested Vic Mignogna do, which was and this is what Warren Ellis did. He was part of a mediation process where he would begin quote unquote conversations with people in the industry. And this is after he had to close his newsletters and step away from the industry. And then, he had been on some kind of a mediated dialogue with these people, and they were guiding him in a transformative justice process. This is taken from SoManyOfUs.com. Yeah, So Many of Us was a group that was hired to be the mediator between Warren Ellis and his accusers. And this was the indoctrination process that Ellis had to go through just so he could be allowed to return to the comic industry. And this is them talking about their guided transformative process. We found an extraordinary facilitator who helped us to understand our options and clarify our goals. Second, we undertook internal processes to define and practice accountability, flexibility, and democracy within our group. Third, in a facilitator-led survey, so many of us, DJ, identified fidelity. The decision is not values and unity. The process of decision-making does not tear us apart, but brings us together. As our two priority factors for decision-making, our forward motion may be slow, but it is intentional. Warren Ellis had this option because he wasn't accused of DMing teenagers or going after minors the way that Ed Piscor was accused of. And of course, as if you've seen my other videos, you know that Piskor didn't do anything wrong. He didn't DM anybody underage. He DM'd a young woman, as evidenced by her own words. Molly Dwyer was 17, turning 18. And as I stated also with the Molly Wright stuff, their sexual encounters were consensual until the blowjob thing was mentioned. And for whatever reason, she weaponized that. And no, there was no encounters at all between Molly Dwyer and Ed Piscor. Dwyer herself said that Piskor did not harm her, and nor is he a pedophile. Those were Dwyer's own words. So this option was taken from him as a result of that. So with this option now out of the way, there was no way for him to ever redeem himself and to reclaim his livelihood. There was only one way for him to go. And people don't understand how effective and demonic a tool that is. It literally robs your soul from you. It leaves you with virtually no hope. This is what Saul Alinsky said with regards to no counterattack against that kind. There's no counterattack against being polarized, being ridiculed, and being targeted. You're just one man fighting an entire planet at that point. I know that's an extreme example, but that's what it feels like. And that goes back to Ed Piscor's note in which he said that the human being was not created to withstand that amount of judgment simultaneously by that many people. And it's easy for us to say what Ed could have done when we're not in that position. What happens when you are in that position? When you have no one to turn to and everybody around you has marked you as a pariah?